estimate the population, I'll explain to you how I do it. So it's a 3-step process. The first step is called stratification. And so what we're doing in this step is basically trying to determine which areas are most likely to have moose and more than 5 or more moose. And we consider those to be high habitat. And in the past, I have this strikeout here, because in the past we used to fly in 185 with 4 people. We'd look out the window and we try to assess the habitat, presence of moose, tracks of moose, and we'd use that to delineate the high. Well, I was looking for ways to reduce costs, and I was also interested in the concept. So I looked at our stratification from various different surveys and discovered that there was very little change from year to year. Most areas we were consistently calling them a high or a low. And so I did some simulations where I created a desktop stratification and then I tested it against previous survey work and decided that this year that would be something that we would try, see how good we could do at a desktop stratification. And it worked pretty well, but I'll tell you that in a minute. Step 2 is we have the whole area gridded out into 6 square mile units. And so these 6 square mile boxes are what we're considering as either high habitat or low habitat. And so we then select from those highs and lows, and we want to have basically, we want to spend most of our time in the area that we're predicting will have those. So 80% of our units, 70 to 85% of our units are going to be in that high strata, and the remainder are going to be in low strata. Because we don't want to spend a lot of time in areas that aren't very good moose habitat, and it might have 0 or 1 moose in them. So then once we've selected those units, we go and grind them out in the supercode. And we spend sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, sometimes longer, depending on the presence of moose, flying in circles or lines to get full coverage of that 6 square mile unit and figure out how many moose are there. For every group of moose or every moose that we see, sometimes we group them together, sometimes it's just a single moose. We record those on a data sheet and mark a GPS waypoint. And that allows us to tell if we've seen a group of moose before. They all start to look the same in some units. And so that really helps us to sort out whether or not they're included in the 6 square mile sampling unit that we're looking at. So then the third step is called citability. And so we have to determine how many moose are present, but that we missed them. And so in the past, what we've done is for every sampled unit, there's an envelope. It's kind of like a little advent calendar. And after you've finished surveying a unit, you open that up and you determine, and it tells you whether or not a unit has been selected for citability, and then which part of the unit you're going to fly. Because we fly half of that unit again with twice the intensity and at the opposite direction from how it was originally flown. So if we originally flew east-west transects, now we're going to fly north-south transects. And we're doing our lines twice as tight and looking for moves and seeing if we pick up any additional moves. This year, I eliminated this step, even though I really believe in citability correction, because we never see all the moose that is there, and I don't care what my column says. We never see all the moose that are there. That's a joke. And so I took the median citability correction factor from the last 5 surveys. So I took the middle value and applied that against this year. And in most years, our citability correction factor for the West Delta is 1.11. So what that means is for every 100 moose that you see, there's probably 11 there that you miss. And that seems pretty reasonable, because when it gets hot and heavy, it's easy to miss animals out there. So that's what I used this year, but I plan to, in future years, reincorporate that citability correction factor when we just have a little more time. This year, we were concerned about, we saw that there was snow in the forecast, we saw that we had a break from the snow, but there was high wind that could maybe creep up on us, and we just needed to get the work done since we were in year 5. I was all in. Okay, so those are the main steps to doing the survey. So I'll show you the difference between, this is a previous survey where we did the stratification flight, and you can tell that the sample units are pretty evenly distributed through the whole area. In the green are the selected units that we sampled, and the purple these are the ones we did this year. So you can see a higher concentration of sampled units in that high habitat, and I'll show you a map that also shows this a little bit more later down the line. So we've shifted our effort to really focus our time more in the areas where we expect the moose to be. So now, getting to the numbers. The numbers that I bolded here are the estimates for the West Delta 6C. So the population estimate settled out at 503 moose. The range and the precision of the survey is very tight. So 497 to 510, that's the tightest common interval I've ever seen doing moose work, and I've been doing it for 15 years now. You can see that we had 22% calves, which is a great calf percentage, and that is consistent with what we see on the West Delta for really great calf production. You can see we looked at 68% of the area, and this number right here is probably the number that's most important to some of you. This is the number of moose that we actually saw with our eyeballs. 446 moose were seen, so without any additional math applied, this is just the number of moose that were seen by the observers and the pilots from the plane. So the difference between the moose observed number and the population estimate comes from our extrapolation to the areas that we didn't look at, and on the West Delta, that's all low habitat, and the application of that siteability correction factor. And so some of you are purists, and you're like, I don't care how you estimate, I don't care about siteability correction factors, I don't care about extrapolation, I care about where you saw the moose and how you saw them. So this map shows you that. The red here are high habitats, and I can provide this map for anyone who wants it at a later time. The green are low habitat, and if a box has a number in it, that's because it was sampled, and that's the number of moose that were seen. So you can see we have units with 50 moose in them. We have a unit with 84 moose in it, 20, 32. You add these up, you can see that they come up to that number, about 450 moose is what we saw with no math applied. So if anyone tells you there's only a couple hundred moose on the West Delta, I beg to differ. So you may be wondering, why do I see more moose than other people have seen, or than other people think are there? And there's a couple different reasons why I think that happens. One reason is the survey timing, and that's probably the biggest reason, is that the people that are flying planes and saying how many moose they're seeing are flying to support a moose hunt, and they're doing it in the fall with full leaf out and brown conditions. I'm flying this survey when moose are concentrated in the winter range and with good snow cover. That's the biggest difference. Also, I think there needs to be a recognition that every year our plants on the Delta are probably growing 6 inches to 12 inches. And that's just going to make it harder to see moose both from an airplane and an airboat. And at some point we have to acknowledge that it's just getting harder to see them than it used to be. And people that grew up here, especially pre-earthquake, when you can see the ocean from the road, can attest to this too. So now I'll explain a little bit about our composition surveys. So these again are the surveys that we use to assess bull cow ratios and calf cow ratios, and both are important metrics in your moose population. We do these surveys in November, and we do it then because that's when we have, hopefully, adequate snow to do the work, and it's before the moose begin to drop their antlers, which usually starts to happen a lot after the first week of December. So we use that random sample, the random sample units are about 6 square miles to drive our sampling efforts. And so I just do a random pick of all the units. I don't worry about stratification that time of year. I fly to the units, we see how many bulls, cows, calves, we classify them in small, medium, and large categories for the bulls, and then see where the numbers shake out. But it's hard work to do because it's become increasingly hard to get white conditions on the Delta in the fall. My predecessor, who was here for 15 years, was consistently able to get composition surveys done every other year. I've only had 2 years in the 10 years that I've been here with adequate conditions to get this fall work done. The days are shorter every single day that goes by in the fall, and that's brutal. Also, you're contending with antler drop, and then any day that it's clear and you could go fly because it's not raining and blowing sideways, there's wind on the copper. And some years that completely prevents us from doing work. Last year, when we had early and persistent snow in the fall, we didn't get this is in the fall of 2021. We didn't get a fall survey because it was just ripping down the property the whole time. So these two maps give you an example of how this random distribution causes the sampling to change from year to year. These are the units I sampled in 2020, and these are the samples I did in 2022. And in 2020, I just started to adapt to the fact that we're just not getting the winter conditions that I need to do this work. We went from 2013 to 2019 without getting the fall conditions that we needed. So in 2020, I started using a locally based R-44 helicopter to fly these surveys. And even though it's still really hard to see moose with brown moose against a brown background, using a helicopter allows us, as soon as we see an animal, we can just stop and hover and classify that animal and look for more. Whereas in a fixed wing aircraft, we have to do a big sweeping circle. Half the time we lose visual contact with that moose, and we're scanning. We're supposed to be scanning and looking for other moose. Sometimes we lose the moose we got. It's just really, really challenging. The helicopter has helped. The downside is it's just really expensive. So it's still hard work to pay to do. So to give you a summary of the results, these are all the results of the last 20 years, but the most important column here is this bull-cow ratio and calf-cow ratio. This is bulls per 100 cows, calves per 100 cows. And our objective for the West Delta is 25 bulls per 100 cows. You can see when I looked in 2020, we were pretty dang close. That's pretty much on target as far as I'm concerned. We're 24 bulls per 100 cows. Calf-cow ratio was good. This year when I went, I saw 11 bulls per 100 cows, 16 calves per 100 cows. But I think this result was really affected by early antler drops. So 30% of the bulls I saw had no antlers at all. I could see pedicle scars, a little red spot on the side of their head, and 15% had only one antler. Anytime you see this amount of antler drop, your chances of having misclassified a bull as a cow is very high. And the fact that this calf-cow number was low suggests that I was misclassifying bulls as cows. So it's going to be in my future to look at this area sooner rather than later again, and hopefully the antler drop won't be as bad. The total number of animals I saw was great. 240 moose is a good sample for classification, but for some reason the moose dropped their antlers earlier this year. So what do we do with all this information now? Well, we have the goal of maximizing our harvest while at the same time keeping the population within objectives. And there's lots of moving parts, a lot of which I can't control and I also can't even understand. Our habitat is changing, and we've had record dry summers and record wet summers in the same 10-year time frame. And that can affect travel conditions and hunter success, how well you can use an airboat, how well you can fly. Calf survival varies from year to year, and I can't really account for that. And then also the participants in the hunt vary in their motivation. When we're issuing a whole lot of permits, you can get some people that aren't as gung-ho about moose hunting as others. So sometimes in the absence of survey data, as I mentioned, we were on our 5th year, and I want to get these areas surveyed every 3 to 5 years. We can respond to other things, and we did respond to other things. So the public was talking to us about concerns about a reduced number of bulls on the landscape. And then so in 2020, we went to the advisory committee and talked to them about the information that we had and asked them what they wanted to do. So what you see on this graph, the diamonds here are population estimates over time. The total height of the bar is the number of permits that we issued in any given year. And then the composition of that, these golden bars are the cow contribution to that total harvest. The red is the state bull contribution, and the blue is the federal bull composition. So in 2020, we met with the advisory committee to talk with them about what we were seeing for bull-cow ratios. Although I didn't have very good data, I hadn't been able to fly, but what the public was telling us, and asked them what they wanted, and they chose a scenario of issuing 5 more cow permits and reducing the take of bulls. So we did that here. Then the next year, we reduced it just a little bit further, and then we reduced the cow total this year going into this fall. And that was all just in response to public sentiment. So basically, if you are seeing things that you want to share, we're receptive to that information, particularly when we're in a time period where we're not able to collect the biological information that we'd like to use to make decisions. So let's put this population estimate in context. The West Delta estimate is about 500 moose, and that is below our population objective. The objective here is shown between 600 and 800. The important thing to note about this is there are confidence intervals for the survey, but they're so tight that they're obscured by that marker because they're from 497 to 510. So they're just underneath that triangle, basically. But the last survey we had huge confidence intervals. And the previous one, they were pretty big too. And so really, there's a possibility this population has been stable and that there hasn't been a change. But in general, I think people feel like it may be slightly down. And I believe it was probably closer to 600, and that we are down a bit. And so I'm going to proceed with this point estimate. Usually that's what we do, even though what I said is true, that any range of values within this range is possible and equally likely. We usually just manage for this middle number. And so now our objective is going to be to bring that number back up into those objectives. So how are we going to do that? It's going to be pretty easy, I think, because all we need to do is take it easy on cows. Our harvest rate on cows is greater than 4% in most years. The industry standard is 1 to 3% harvest rate on cows, and a lot of areas don't have a harvest of cows at all. Martin River, we don't harvest cows. We don't harvest cows anymore in Controller Bay. Most areas of the state don't have very much cow harvest. We harvest a lot of cows, and so all we need to do is pump the brakes on that. When we do that, it's going to increase the breeding cows in the population. That's also going to improve our inputs of bulls, because with breeding cows, 50% of the calves that are produced are probably going to be male calves, which can grow up to be full-grown bulls. So our strategy for the West Delta, we need to achieve our population objective of between 600 and 800 moose. We want to provide predictable permit opportunity availability, and we want to increase that bull-cow ratio. So I'll show this graphic again, and what you notice is, since I showed up here, I've tried to make really gradual and measured changes in the number of permits available, and previously there was a lot of volatility here. We went from 40 permits to almost 80 permits in 1 year, and then all the way up above 120 permits in 1 year, and then whacked it way back. And the population in these diamonds responded the same way. And so I'm trying to provide something that's just a little smoother, because I think the public prefers a more gradual changes, and maybe would like, forego some opportunity in the short term to have a more sustainable and predictable opportunity. So that's one of the things that I'm seeking to do. And so the thing I want to show you about this graphic is what happened here. With this reduction of permits, particularly cow permits over time, you see this big jump. And so this is a 1 year jump from about 400 moose to about 600 moose. So that kind of an increase is possible when you just modify this cow number. And so that's what we're going to seek to do here. So now let's talk about the Martin River a little bit. Martin River experiences deeper snow and probably more predation from both bears and wolves. And calf retention is always lower. In the spring when we look there, our calf numbers are always lower than on the West Delta. So these numbers in whole are the estimates for the Martin River. So 260 moose is the population estimate, with a range between 211 and 309. You can see that lower calf number here, about 15%. We looked at 42% of the area. So we looked at less area, but again, that's because more of the area is low habitat. And we saw 171 moose in this area. And so we had to extrapolate more to this population, and I'll show you that same graphic again that just shows raw uncooked moose There's been no statistics applied. This is just the number of moose seen. You can see we have anywhere from 0 moose in the high, which are the red units, to 28. And so here we have 2 unsampled units in the Martin. And just having 2 units that could be anywhere from 0 to 28 affects the error of that estimate, and that's part of why the confidence intervals are larger. And part of the problem with all this is in statistics, anytime you have overall a small sample, you can get a lot of weirdness in what happens with your numbers. So it has 2 things going on. The fact that we didn't do these 2 highs, and then the fact that there's all this green that's kind of lightly sampled. There's just a whole lot more of that. So to put this number in perspective, you can see we're here at 260, the upper end in the range for the management objectives. Mike and Jared and I all feel like we're probably closer to that upper end, but again, I'm going to manage it for this 260 mark. You may be wondering if I think this was real, and I do. I do think our population was high, but I was a little skeptical of it from the start, and since we got that number, I've been managing as if the population was 350 and setting the quota accordingly, just in case, because it was the first time in 20 years that we were within the population objective. But I'll tell you why I think this number is real, and that we have seen a bit of a decline, and then why I think that decline happened. So this is the moose composition for the Martin River side. This is, again, the column I want you to pay the most attention to. So you can see when I flew in 2014, we had a bull cow ratio of 18 bulls per 100 cows and a huge calf cow ratio. 36 calves per 100 cows is a very good calf cow ratio. We saw 102 moose. We went back 2 years later and saw more than twice as many moose with the same effort and a whole lot more bulls. And what that told me is these calves grew up and they recruited into that population. And that was why we saw more moose on that fall composition estimate than when we completely estimated the population in 2014. So I believe that the population grew, but I think in the meantime, we haven't had great years for calves. I don't know why that year was so good for calves, but years since then, I think haven't been very good. And that's why that number took a dip again. This just gives you an idea of the distribution for that fall survey, if you were curious where I saw all those moose. The darker reds and oranges are areas that had higher concentrations, so between 22 and 54 moose. These oranges are 14 to 21, and the yellows are 5 to 13. So that 2016 survey was pretty interesting. Something big happened in the Martin, but it hasn't kept up since that time. I don't think the decline that we're seeing has anything to do with the harvest. I think it has to do with calves, but the prudent thing to do is just to reduce our quota. So our plan for the Martin River is to reduce that quota back to 25. We're going to assess the composition again and see where we're at for bull cow and calf cow, if we can, with the weather. So people have brought up the idea with me about splitting the quota for the Martin River hunt and having a portion of the quota available to road system hunters and people that focus on Long Island, and a portion of that quota available to the Martin River proper. I'm open to ideas like that if they're vetted through your advisory committee. So I would say anytime someone has an idea about what they want to see in a change in hunt management, the best thing to do is either get involved with your advisory committee, find out who's on it, and talk to them about your ideas. And we have a bunch of AC members here tonight. Another idea is talking about changes in the controlled use area for the Martin River. Some people don't like the fact that we have a walk-in period and rules about same-day motorized, and they want that to only apply in the road system areas. And that's totally something people can pursue, but it will require Board of Game action. So I'm actually leaving later this week to go to the Board of Game meeting, and in order to do that, you need to put in a proposal to the Board of Game, and that's in about 3 years that you could put that proposal in. So I encourage people to do that if they want to see change like that, and I can help people navigate that process, but it's not something that I can do. So I know I'm going to get this question, so I made the graph, and I'm putting it up here. People want to know the distribution of harvest. and where the moose in the martin are coming from. So these dark blue bars here are moose that were taken in Sheep Creek. Anything above that in the green are moose that were taken from Copper River Highway, Long Island, basically like accessible to, supported by a vehicle. Anything below the blue bars are boat supported or airplane supported. And so because they're Martin River proper, Gilded Springs area, so this shows you basically that for a long time, the majority of the moose were not being taken off the road system. And there's been a bit of a shift in recent years. In some years, though, there's still more moose being taken not off the road system. And in a lot of years, it's pretty close to 50-50. But people always ask me, what about all these moose that are coming off of Long Island? And how about all these road system moose? Here you go. And then also people want to know about the walk-in period and who's utilizing the walk-in period and how many moose are being taken in that time. You can see that in most years it's less than 5 moose taken during the walk-in period, and the rest happens after the walk-in period is over. But we did have some big years here where about 50% of the harvest happened during the walk-in period, and that got people really talking about how the walk-in period is affecting them, either positively or negatively. So I threw this graph again because I knew I'd get a question, and there it is. So future plans for both areas, we're going to reduce quotas a bit until we get to within our objectives. I'm going to continue to fly twinning surveys. And so twinning surveys are surveys that I fly about the 3rd week of May every year. And basically what I'm looking for are cows that have calves, and I want to see of those cows with calves, how many have twins and how many have singletons. And that information is really indicative of habitat quality. So if you have poor habitat, you won't find very many moose with calves at all, and the ones you find will only have singles. If your habitat is very robust, you'll have very high twin rates. Anything above single digits is considered pretty good twinning rate. Our twinning rate is about 44%, says consistently. So no red flags for habitat there. But I'm going to keep doing those surveys. We're actually going to start a moose sampling program. And so some of you may remember these from back in the day. But we are going to be asking you to bring in your moose, either your whole moose jaw or the last 4 inches of the jaw, so that we can pull a tooth from that moose. And what we're looking at figuring out is, I'm very interested in the kind of cows that we're taking, because you can't take a cow with a calf. Are we taking very young cows? Are we taking old cows? Are we taking prime age cows? Are we taking a year off between breeding? I would really like to look at that question. And so the other thing I'm interested in is how the size at age of a bull is it the same as it's been in previous time periods when we sampled moose, or has that changed? So basically, are moose smaller or bigger at a given age than they used to be? So that would involve measuring antlers and pulling teeth. So if you drew a moose or you intend to pull or to hunt moose this fall, we're going to be asking you for some samples, and prepare yourself for that by doing postmortem dentistry. I'll continue to do fall moose composition surveys, with my first priority being the Martin Valley this year, and then going to the West Copper Delta. And I'm going to conduct another population estimate, but not before the spring of 2025. And the only way I do it in the spring of 2025 is if the conditions were perfect. We're going to shoot for that 3 to 5 year time frame. That allows me to spend money on some of these other metrics that also tell me what I need to know. And really, surveying the population with a higher frequency with that wouldn't really give me a clear picture of what's going on. So now I'm ready for those questions. I'll give a shout out to Milo for always letting me use his pictures, and he has a bunch of really great ones. So, anybody got a question?
Was there any survey effort in 6A?
The last time we surveyed 6A, so that would be Controller Bay and then all the way over to Icy Bay, was in 2020. And that population looked to be a little bit, the west portion of that looked to be down a bit, and that's why we got rid of the non-resident draw. And that was the action that we took in response to that. I'm hoping maybe next year to go look there again. I'd like to do that area about every 5 years. So yeah, and then the areas east of the Suckling Hills to Icy Bay, that had only actually been surveyed one other time in its entirety. So the number was pretty much exactly the same as the previous time, but with 2 data points, you can't really say what's going on.
I got one more question. When we came up with the population objectives, it was quite a few years ago, and quite frankly, it was an educated guess with best information available to us at the time. Do you think we missed on 6B population objective? That's what I'm talking about.
So yeah, so the objective for the West Delta we looked at in 2017, but the objective for the Martin River has not been messed with since the late 90s. And I've always wondered that, like, is that objective just unreasonably high? And I mean, obviously, we were in a window of time. We were probably in that objective, but you know, we haven't had the benefit of the habitat studies that have been done in the West Delta. And the West Delta has just been looked at more thoroughly than a lot of other places as far as browse utilization, twinning rates, rump fat depths. I've tried to do twinning surveys on the East Delta to see if I can assess, you know, what's going on with habitat there. But it's really hard. Vegetation is higher, and because the moose density is lower, my ability to find parturient cows or cows with calves is really low. So yeah, I don't know, but I wonder about that. I wonder if it's an unreasonable objective. But yeah, we had to pull something out of the sky.
Yeah, like I said, now is the best information in the names.
Yeah, I will say that my predecessor was comfortable with a higher harvest rate than is the industry standard. So for like a 10-year period, we were harvesting well above the 12% harvest rate, and 8 to 12% is what you would shoot for with an all-full harvest. And so when I got here, I dialed it back a little bit. I don't know if that had any contributing factor to the increase that we saw. I think it probably didn't, but I'm trying to have a quota that I think is more reasonable. So maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, he did kind of have a reputation for wanting to kill everything.
Well, we all skirt a balance, right, between providing harvest opportunity. We want to allow people to put moose in the freezer. And we don't want a big winter kill event where a bunch of moose die, and we could have provided that opportunity for people to put them in the freezer. But you skirt a balance, right? Because if you provide too much opportunity, you're not going to grow your population, and you run the risk of not keeping it in objectives. It's a hard balance to hit, and sometimes we nail it, sometimes we don't.
I just remember his comment that deer, like rabbits, don't worry about it.
I think it was blackbirds.
So on the West Delta, your objective kept climbing through time.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it doing that?
Because because of this fact that our objectives are set through an advisory committee process that's sometimes guided by a lot of science and sometimes not. So I can go back to that slide if we can hit it. But the initial number that they came up with was just a swag. You know, they just pulled the number. And then, but this was a growth objective. We want to grow this population to about 400 moose in this period of time. Okay? And so then when they did that, they're like, okay, we're above that. Now what do we want to do? And so then they said, well, 400 to 500. That sounds good. And in the meantime, there were some studies done. Tom Stevenson did a study on carrying capacity, and McCracken did a study on carrying capacity. And both of those guys came up with a very wide range of possibilities. There's actually a hidden slide about this, so you can see it if you go to just the slide view. So they came up with a wide range of possibilities. And so when your range is that huge, you just have to pick somewhere within it. And it could be, you could be on, you could be off. Uh-oh. I can drag it over so you can. So, let's see, I think it's this one. Can you make that slide? Yeah. Okay, so 1997 is when McCracken estimated the carrying capacity, and he said, well, it's probably somewhere between 380 moose and 1,424. And so people are like, well, what do I do with that? And I actually found the correspondence between the biologist at the time, who I think was Roy Nellen, and him, and he said, well, shoot for 600. Well, that wasn't what they did in the meantime, but he said, go for a guideline of growth, 600 moose, and then monitor your habitat and see where you're at. In 2006, Stevenson projected that we were going to have a 31 to 53% long-term decline due to vegetation changes, depending on winter severity. So what he was thinking about there is conversion from willow habitat to alder habitat, and maybe even to spruce habitat. And he was very worried about this, and they were using satellite map projections. So then another biologist studied this. Her name was Sharon Smythe, and she found that our plant communities have not changed in the way that they thought they were going to change. And they used satellite maps. They used our survey data and showed that moose are using more area than they originally thought they would. So they thought they were going to use this really constricted winter range. We found that's just not the case. They're using lots of area. And this was tested by the most severe winter on record. In 2011, 2012, we found the moose, actually, we didn't lose very many. In fact, our population continued to grow. The moose were able to get up on top of that snowpack and access vegetation that was like nearly virginal to them. And so even the most severe record, winter on record, found the estimate of moose that would be lost was just off. So yeah, when they modeled the population and came up with these carrying capacity estimates, they look at these various different scenarios of mild, moderate, and severe winters. And then all of these different researchers have looked at that and sliced and diced that in different ways. But the most recent data is from Smythe. She recommends maximum sustained yield between 800 and 1,200. So that's lower than what our advisory, or sorry, higher than what our advisory committee is asking for. And so we're erring on the side of providing a bit more harvest opportunity over growing the population. And a point estimate of 1,000 moose. And so we could do that, and that's why we have this conversation with the advisory committee. Do you want me to shoot for that? Because there's always this cost benefit, right? If you leave more moose in the landscape and then you have a severe winter, you can have more winter kill. If you take more moose and have more harvest opportunity, you won't have as much winter kill, but you won't grow as many. Yeah.
I did said it was a decade to build them up, and if you choose to build them up, it takes time and you forego harvest.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Anybody else have a question?
So we're due for several years of El Nino weather, mild winters. What's your thoughts on increasing the population because of mild winters and virtually no losses of cows and bulls, probably some of calves, obviously, but calves probably should be better over winter, do you think?
Yeah. I'm not worried about it at all. I wonder if I have I think our habitat, or there's evidence that our habitat can support a lot more than we're demanding from it. And so I think those mild winters are conducive. And that might be why we saw such great productivity in the marten that year. Was just from like not having very much snow in 2015, 2014. I don't know, but there's nothing I can do about weather, right? So the hardest thing about mild winters is just not having the survey conditions to assess the population. But I'm kind of figuring out, that's the thing about this talk, is like, I've figured out some things in this last 10 years. I don't know how much comfort that is to people, that I'm figuring out how to study this population better. It's very comforting to me. Whether it's comforting to the users, I don't know, but it's very comforting to me. So I've figured out, that I can't wait for fall snow to do a fixed wing survey. I may just need to go out and look at a helicopter. I've figured out how to make these spring surveys more efficient, cost effective, and faster. So hopefully I can use some of those changes to adapt if we get more mild winters in the future. Yeah, or-
With increased guides in that other side of suckling in that trophy only area, are you seeing an increase in harvest?
So the harvest of moose in 6A, which is everything, we'll just refine this to everything east of the suckling, like you said, is really volatile. And so you could have years where we kill almost 30 moose, and then you have years that we kill 10. And everything in between. And I attribute almost all of that to how hard the guys are marketing in the winter. Some years the guys are going to lock the shows, some years the guys are going overseas and courting the Duke of Spain or whatever, and other years they're not beating the bushes so hard for clients. And so we see this volatility, and I don't attribute any of it to biology. So.
But there's an increase of guides in that area on the Sayou River and down at the logging cap and Isis Bay.
Yeah.
And so it seems like to me there's a lot more hunters. I know it's, weather has a lot to do with the ability to move them.
Yeah.
It just seems like there should be a bigger harvest to me, but I haven't heard about it.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, is when you have, so this area that we're talking about has antler restriction, so you're only able to shoot moose above a certain size. And so as a result, you're somewhat limited by the fact that biology of that population is only going to allow a fixed amount of animals to get to that threshold. And you're leaving animals in as breeding stock that aren't at that threshold. And so in theory, those populations that have an antler restriction are somewhat self-regulating. But the question is everybody harvesting moose that are truly in that size range? Because it's a very difficult area to enforce. And I'd like to think they are, but I don't know.
Well, I filled out my moose report online this year, and I was contacted by the Forest Service 3 different times. And I thought I did everything proper on the computer. It seemed like they wanted a lot more information than what I had given them.
Well, I know that the Forest Service has, in the past, the Forest Service has collected on their permit, which is again the bulk of the harvest on the West Delta. They have collected data on antlers, spread, and brow tines. And that changed in 2020 when all the reporting went online. Those fields were omitted from the online permitting option. And all of this happened at a time that we were very curious about the size of animals that were taken from the West Delta. Where are the big bulls? Are big bulls being taken? Are big bulls being harder to find? In the past, when we saw those really big jumps in the number of permits issued and corresponding jump in harvest, we were able to see a change in the bull size distribution. We can't do that right now because those data were lost. So they thought they got it back on the permit, but then they told me they must not have had it back on the permit, and so they were making phone calls to get that information.
Yeah,
So,
just a few days ago.
Yeah. But, yeah, that's all I know about that. I think Kate called you.
No, what?
Okay.
What do you mean?
They're telling me they're trying to get it back on the permit. Because it is.
All I know about that is that it is a really big, as you might imagine, Mark, a really big convoluted mess to try to change that form. And with Milo retiring, and they didn't have another person detailing into that position until fairly recently. Faith Pearson is now detailing into it out of the Seward office. All that didn't happen this past year, and now and it like showed up on the back side of the permit on the part like you didn't even get. So it was a huge mess. So hopefully they'll fix it this year.
And we'll be able to collect that from you. We can measure and collect that at that time. If you just close out your whole harvest report. The one thing this is going to require, since so much of the harvest on the West Delta is in that federal hunt, it's going to require people to report more promptly. And you may have reported very promptly, but there are a lot of people that don't tell the Forest Service that they killed a moose. They figure the moose already thinks that the Forest Service already thinks that moose is dead. They don't need to tell anyone about it, and so then they get a follow-up phone call. we need to get the data from that moose this year. We want to learn more about these animals, so we're hoping we'll also get that information more quickly. Other questions?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned something that maybe I misheard you, but something about the brush is growing 6 to 12 inches a year or something like that. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah.
What brush?
So when Sharon Smythe went out and did her carrying capacity estimate, one of the things she was doing is measuring vegetation height. And you could like totally geek out on plants. You go out there and you do these transects and you measure plants in all different kinds of ways and you measure the species composition. And so this has been done numerous times. Every time this carrying capacity study happens, so in 97, in 2006, and then again in 2015, they're measuring plants. And so the Forest Service actually has the way to assess what that precise current rate of annual growth is. I'm just estimating based on what I see with my eyes or the willows in your neighborhood or whatever, what that is. But the total height of the brush is getting higher. And we can show that through those efforts that they've done. What, Corey? Yeah, tell me.
You're true.
Yeah.
Maybe higher than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's dramatic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't keep track of the vegetation on the Delta very much, but except at Cudahy Slough where I hang out every summer a little bit, sometimes a lot. But it's definitely, the spruce have definitely gotten more extensive and bigger over time. But I've also hiked around out in the meadows and stuff, and it seems like there's still a lot of willow around there too. So I don't know if it's become a limited thing. But it's definitely dynamic. Things have changed a lot.
Yeah. And I don't, again, like the science doesn't support that the succession of plants is happening at the rate that people thought that it would. But I think overall, the willows aren't changing to something else, but they are probably getting taller in a lot of areas. But, winter conditions, you can have scouring events and various different things that reinitiate that on its own. But the data set's there. And I would love for it to look at, because right now it's just a hypothesis, the rate of that annual growth.
Just one observation, still seeing these sheds taking a chunk of the skull out.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any studies on that's going to be a problem in the future, or?
So McCracken, the researcher that did the first carrying capacity estimate in the late 90s, he actually wrote a paper on abnormal antler cast. So what Mark's describing is a lot of moose, a fair number of moose on the Copper River Delta particularly, when they shed their antler, it doesn't cleave at the normal point of obsession, so the normal spot on the pedicle bone that it would break off from. Doesn't do that properly, it retains a portion of their skull, and so you have this jagged edge with a chunk of skull bone on that. So then the question is, first question is, why does that happen? Second question is, what happens to the next antler that grows, and is there a relationship between this abnormal antler cleave and some of our abnormal antler formations that we see here? Our moose antlers here are atypicals, or what they're called, are a lot more common here than in other places. So the question is why? So he looked at a variety of different factors, but back in the late 90s, they didn't have the tools to look at genetics. And so he took a big pile of sheds that had normally cleaved and a big pile of sheds that had a retained portion of that pedicle bone. And he compared them. And he found that there were differences in trace mineral uptake between the two sets of bones. I think it was iron and phosphorus that were the two that were statistically different. But he said, in the end, well, these two things are statistically different. That is probably a genetic thing from this population from a small number of individuals. So since that time, both Fish and Game and the native village of Eak have sampled moose, research samples, and looked at genetic diversity of our moose herd, and with the idea that maybe this is from what we call the deleterious receptive alleles. So when you have a population with low genetic diversity, higher likelihood of something that has negative health effects surfacing. And both MBE study and Fish and Game study showed higher genetic diversity in this population than in the populations that our moose came from. So the orphan moose that started this moose population came from Anchorage and Soldat and Kenai. And those two populations are distinct. So our population is a blending of those two populations and has a signature from upriver. And then even potentially from the east. And so our moose are more genetically diverse than moose in other places, and that is not very suggestive that what we're seeing is a genetic effect. I think it has to do with environment, and that's why I see this variability in antler cast from year to year. My predecessor, Dave Crowley, would only ever see 1 or 2 one-antlered bulls when he was flying those composition surveys. And we've had years where we had, 60% of our bulls were one-antlered. And so I think it varies from year to year. I don't know why. He thought at the time that maybe the difference in mineral uptake had to do with aquatic plants in summer conditions. But I'd love to study it. I've also wondered about Elodia, and if Elodia has some kind of nutritional difference for moose. But I will never get to investigate these questions. So.
How about any other health issues? Do people come in to, I've run into a lot of pus pockets and stuff like that in the meat, that could be from the rut or whatever, but.
Yeah.
Does anybody report any of that?
Occasionally people talk to me about things that they see. Like Tom Baylor took a moose this year that smelled funny and looked funny to him, and we talked about it, and I showed pictures to people, and we looked at it. But not very many moose that people aren't just like, wow, this is a healthy animal. It's predominantly, I wouldn't say you have any evidence that we have very high disease prevalence here. Everything we see is what we would expect to see in the population, and that's very much of it.
Well, this is the only moose population that I know, so I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with it.
Yeah. Right.
Did you ever get the data from the Forest Service on the number of people that actively hunted and how many animals were actually taken?
So they sent me today some information on that. So the question that people often bring to me is, has success rate gone down? And the best we can figure so far, and I didn't look at the numbers that they sent me from just this last season, I didn't have time to look at that today, is that it's not really going down. When we have moose that aren't taken, it's because people weren't really pursuing them. And so, that question's there, but success rates haven't very meaningfully gone down in recent years. But yeah, that's a Forest Service data set, and sometimes I have it right away, and sometimes it takes some time. Turnover and whatnot.
Is there any evidence that moose are eating horsetail in the fall?
I don't know anything about that.
The reason I ask is because horsetail is a phosphorus pump. So Westing Canada geese and upper swans eat pretty heavily on that at times. And if moose did, they'd be picking up the phosphorus that they need for stronger bones.
Yeah, I don't know about moose consumption of horsetail. Like they'd have to.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely, frankly.
Is that horsetail kind of a grass that grows like a bamboo?
Yeah.
Yeah, they definitely concentrate in areas where that grows, especially in late fall. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks, everyone.